and this is broadcast number 649, May the 14th, 1984. This time last week I was talking about a secret intelligence group in the Pentagon called the Monarch Eagle that was formed for the Special Forces, patterned after Nazi Germany and set up by Germans who were let out of prison by John J. McCloy and the powers that be, and formed the Green Berets and this special group. They train at Fort Bragg, South Carolina. The courts were sealing up the DeLorean data, and I have a lot to update you on the trial. Down in Los Angeles, DeLorean isn't on trial. The FBI is on trial. They can't afford to let the information on DeLorean, his money, his counterintelligence activity, his links with drugs and Swiss banks, to come out in the open. So up till now, week 2 or 3 of the trial, it's only the FBI on trial and not John DeLorean. Then the bulk of the program last year was on Chester Davis, the lawyer who died just a year ago, one of the most important men of American history, associate of Howard Hughes, never saw Howard Hughes, but helped run the empire after the mysterious Hughes had been shipped from the Beverly Hills Hotel to a hospital in Boston. I was watching last night on television before I went to bed the magic show of Doug Henning and some of his mysterious sawing people in half and large objects that disappear or compressing people into the shape of a disc. There's a Howard Hughes disc somewhere. The biggest magic show going is not Doug Henning, but the Howard Hughes empire that was cut down, compressed, and put on a shelf as a disc. And the inventor, the pilot, the genius who had the tool bit his father invented for drilling oil, had the biggest disappearing act of American history or world history, or one of them. Is pretty good competition, and went from Boston and then was never seen again, even by Robert Mayu in Las Vegas. And he took a hunk of money they got him to sell, or the body sold, or the double sold, or the brain connived, the person who took out his brains. They arranged the sale of the TWA, and then this team of magicians, because they did it in front of our eyes, took these hunks of millions of dollars of cash, $535 million of cash, and went to Vegas and started to buy up the 5 hotels and casinos. Now, Paul Laxalt was the governor of Las Vegas. He runs the GOP fundraising. He's a senator. Imagine walking in with $535,000 worth of cash and buying these places and never seeing the man who put the money down, and not a trace that he existed in the hotel. That is such a great story, the Howard Hughes story. And there's a writer from London who's in LA that wants information on the Hughes story. I said, I don't have the time to go over it with you. I have every book on Hughes that has been published so far and as many articles as I could ever get, 4 full filing drawers plus more. It is the saga of America, what happens to a genuine person born into a prominent family, 3rd generation, Harvard-educated, brilliant inventor, father, imaginative person who worked in test flew airplanes for the United States government, who can be abducted so his empire becomes the umbrella. I use the term for the Nazification of America, and because it's a private empire, we can't get our sticky fingers on it. Well, big story, of course, this week was the Soviet Union not coming to the Olympic Games. I brought up the subject several times on this broadcast, many times, and the most recent broadcast was April 23rd. That was number 646, if you want to order those back tapes. I gave examples of huge newspaper stories, not little articles, but full half pages or 3/4 pages, one from the Los Angeles Times, Defections, a touchy matter for the Olympics, how they were going to encourage the people to defect, not only the athletes, but their trainers. Another large story in the Los Angeles Herald, anti-Soviets vow that protests will be a major Olympic event with all the violence of the CARP group, the Reverend Moon group, the Alpha 66 formed by our CIA, and the anti-Castro Cubans. Another large article in the Washington Post, group set safety net to snatch defectors. That's the Young Americans for Freedom, the political right, the group involved with the Munich massacre in 1972. Another large story, the Soviet newspaper alleges Olympic kidnap schemes. There was so much on the Olympic Games, and in that same broadcast, on April 23rd, I talked about Jay Paul of the Los Angeles Police Department passing data and information to Western goals. That's the John Birch Society. That's the military. It links to the Galen Nazi group in Europe and Austria, and how Jay Paul was working with terrorists in the United States who would in fact be in Los Angeles for the Olympic Games, and how the Public Disorder Information Division of the Police Department went from that department to the Anti-Terrorist Division, so that all elements of the radical right, the military might, linked to Admiral Edward Teller, the hydrogen bomb, Admiral Moore, the Joint Chief of Staff, former Joint Chief of Staff, and the who's who of the Nazis, and Mr. John Singlaub of the World Anti-Communist League, all the elements of the CIA, the Defense Department, of Navy intelligence, not the street people. The argument of having the Soviet Union come and change their mind is that we have freedom of speech in America, and these dissident groups can be on the street talking. This comes from the top down, from the National Security Council, from the White House, from the top agencies of CIA, Navy intelligence, Defense Department. If Mae Brussell can figure that out, certainly the Soviet Union did. Now, Dianne Feinstein had a comment in the paper this week that there should be no defection. See, that was the problem, was advertising that we're going to let them defect. And she said in San Francisco, and I was interested in what she said because the Democratic conventions will be up there, she said the Olympics is not intended to be for a political thing, and that those officials, in quotes, could not ignore the dangerous conditions for Soviet athletes, that we should never allow defections, that anyone who tries it should be arrested, instead of the Los Angeles Times and Herald advertising that they're supplying and supporting safe houses for the defections. One article in the San Francisco Chronicle referred to, many of you have seen these quotations, that the United States is undermining the Olympics with political maneuvers. Another story from the Soviet Union, that they were setting up committees with safe houses and encouraging defections of the Soviet Eastern Europe. Now, Mr. Uberoth, who I wouldn't trust at all, Peter Uberoth, who is in charge of the official Olympic Committee, tried sour grapes to say that now we're paying the price for Jimmy Carter's decision in 1980 not to send the United States Olympic team to Moscow. If Jimmy Carter made that decision in 1980, it was the responsibility of the American Olympic Committee in 1984 to say, look, we understand how you felt then, and since then we took the whole country of Grenada and we've spent billions of dollars in El Salvador and Nicaragua and Guatemala, and now we're funding Costa Rica. We want to own all of Central America. If you take the Balkans, Afghanistan's on your border, hey, we understand how you feel, because 4 years later, we're having the same thing on our border. So tit for tat, let's be fair. We're not any worse off now having those people on our border than you were off 4 years ago when you were forced to go into Afghanistan with the CIA stations there. It's disgusting to say that they just were waiting to get even and not go into the reasons that some people are mentioning, the blatant effort to body snatch the trainers and the athletes. Now, Daryl Gates had an article in the LA Herald and San Jose Mercury. The Soviets had a chance to plan the security. I don't swear on the air, so I'll just say BS. That's absolutely ridiculous. That's like saying that the Secret Service had a chance to protect John Kennedy in Dallas. Hell, you can kill a president, right, going down the street with a Secret Service drunk all in the night before. And with what they did, the FBI and the CIA and the Secret Service and the Army intelligence and the Navy intelligence in covering up the murder of John Kennedy right in our own country with our own president. He's only president 1,000 days. How could the Soviets plan security for so many people in a city the size of Los Angeles with all the nuts that are around there? Now, David Balsagar prided himself that a small group of people could make the big giant fade away. He says, we anticipated 100 or 200 defections, and it does our heart good to think how much control we had over the mighty Soviet Union that they pulled away. But the whole point is that David Wayne Balsagar isn't a small group. He isn't a handful of people. He may have had petitions where he wanted 1 million names and he only had 10,000. But you only need 5. If you have 5 people, you could change the course of history. If you just had bullets in the brains of 5 different people, you could control the world. And he says the world's largest superpower buckled under these issues because the United States government won't muzzle us. He isn't the problem. His problem is, where does he work for the space scientists, for the people down in the Los Angeles area? What is the Anaheim, the Smith, Donald S. Smith Associates, the advertising agencies, the high-tech firms? This guy has inroads into the bowels of the government, of the intelligence system, of the counterintelligence system, of the Defense Department. That's like saying with Western goals and J. Paul there that there's no danger to Los Angeles or people in the world because information went from the LAPD into a computer in Alexandria, Virginia. It wasn't a computer in Virginia. It was people with computers in Berlin, in Vienna, in Taiwan, in South Korea. Once the information, hundreds of thousands of documents that were supposed to be destroyed, get into the computer, then it goes to every police department around the country. So the argument that, look what we did and we're a few, is ridiculous. This guy has been working with the police department and pulling this all along. Now, the origins of all this didn't just begin yesterday. In some way, before we blow ourselves to smithereens, we have to have a little honesty about where these problems evolved. There's a book, there's several books I might turn you on to. One is called The Ignorant Armies by E.M. Halliday. It was published by Harper in 1958. And this is the use of American armies that were sent with Britain to make war against Russia when they had the revolution. The Americans had a revolution that we celebrate on the 4th of July, and we're so proud of having our independence from this oppression. The French had the revolution. They celebrate getting rid of the monarchy and having a constitution independence. When the Russians got rid of the Tsar and the pogroms and the horrible police of Russia and had a revolution, Britain and the United States had armies right on the border from 1918, 1919. Now, in 1905, maybe you saw the movies on TV of Sidney Riley. He worked with the Japanese as an agent from Great Britain to bomb the entire Russian fleet. He burned all his friends at the same time and destroyed the Russian fleet in 1905 because Great Britain wanted to control the seas. Bombay, Ceylon, Singapore, China, the narcotics traffic, the tea, the diamonds, India. They didn't want to compete, the oil traffics or anything else, with Russia. So England and Japan were attacking Russia when the Tsar was there. It has nothing to do with communism. There would be a war if the Tsar was still in power. We'd have the same amount of wars because people like to control territory. The French had theirs, the Spanish had theirs, the British had theirs. Japan's a small island. It can identify with England. Russia was big. So those two got together with people like Riley and bombed Russia in 1905. And when the revolution came and the people brought in the Bolsheviks and communism, that was a worse threat to monarchies and empires like the emperors of Japan or the monarchy of Great Britain with their cousins on every throne of Europe. So the problem began then. And when Nikita Khrushchev was in Los Angeles in 1959, he reminded the people at the banquet he was at of the days when America sent soldiers to their revolution to stop their oppression. Mr. Holliday also wrote an article in 1958 for American Heritage. If you want to look it up in the library, it's called Where Ignorant Armies Clash by Night. And it is the use of American troops at that point with Herbert Hoover, who owned all those millions of dollars of oil and mineral and forests in Russia, to get that government out so that his personal profit would be back in his pocket. And if he couldn't do it alone, he would begin arming our tax dollars, like the $55 million that he sent, the Congress made note of, to overthrow the country. So the war that we're having isn't just a war against an antichrist. It isn't even a war necessarily because of labor and management or what Marx dreamt of. The war began in 1905 with Sidney Riley and Japan, and it will continue until the small islands who are dependent upon trade, learn that they have to live with land masses that are a bit larger. And America is a landmass who has to allow Grenada or Nicaragua to live without a Somoza family. We have to some way assure the little people that we will trade and help them instead of giving them weapons to kill each other, and then we come in and sweep it up. So these problems of wars began a long time ago, and the reaction to the Olympic Games is perfectly logical of the Soviet Union, but it comes from years of history and experience with what America is capable of doing. Now, there was an article in the Houston Post about questionnaires for the security of the Olympic Games. The Olympic security guards are hired, most of them, by a company called California Plant Protection. There's 3 companies hiring the guards for the Olympics, and Dr. Arthur LeBlanc, L-E, then a capital B-L-A-N-C, is a consulting psychologist for this firm that has questionnaires on employment. And these were some of the questions for working security at the Olympic Games. I'll read you 5 of them, or 6. 1, these are true or false. Everything is turning out just like the prophets in the Bible said it would. I believe in the second coming of Christ. I believe in life hereafter. I believe there is a devil and a hell and an afterlife. I believe there is a God. Now, the Anti-Defamation League asked them to delete these questions from the psychological screening. So if you prefer not to answer them, that means that it isn't yes on all of those, so you must be an antichrist. So you can't be a guard at the Olympic security system. This is set up in Los Angeles. These are the kind of questions that the California Plant Protection, it's called, similar to the Wackenhut Corporation, asked. They've been asking this for 15 years. Now, the Vicki Morgan tapes are in the newspaper again. There was a story during the week and 2 today, 1 from the San Jose Mercury. The lawyers asked the government to hand over any sex tapes showing Edwin Meese. You remember when now Edwin Meese is nominated for the Attorney General, and you remember when Vicki Morgan had her head smashed open with a baseball bat, the mistress of Alfred Bloomingdale, and we've done many broadcasts on this, so I don't have to go backwards. If ever you want it, you can get the broadcast. We'll go further. Marvin Pankos is being charged with the murder of Vicki Morgan. He claims that there are no fingerprints, no proof that he did kill her, but there was another person in the closet when she was killed, and that other person took the tapes that were at the house. And the lawyer for Pankos, this Arthur Barron, has subpoenaed those tapes because he claims this would explain the motive for cracking her skull open. So he has subpoenaed the FBI and the CIA for sex tapes of Edwin Meese or other government officials that might appear on the tapes. And the attorney for Edwin Meese, Mr. Leonard Garment of Watergate fame, said, I think it's absolutely outrageous to print this story. Not the fact that it happened, but the fact that it was printed. The subpoena is filed for defendant Marvin Pankos. He wants, in quotes, all documents, audio tapes, videotapes depicting or relating to Vicki Morgan and presidential advisor Edwin Meese or any other government official presently employed on the White House staff or any U.S. senator or congressman. And these have been, the individuals cited in the subpoena for the trial of Pankos include Betsy Bloomingdale and a Gordon Basichis, B-A-S-I-C-H-I-S, a writer who was a close friend of Vicki Morgan. Then there was another story in the news just today. Lawyers asked the government to hand over sex tapes showing, pardon me, that was the one I just did. I have 3 of them, and that was the one I just gave to you. Lawyers' sex tape case may erupt again. That's the next tape. The Vicki Morgan sex tapes, controversy and allegations of the Reagan administration officials that they were present at orgies is going to surface at the trial of Marvin Pankos. The defense attorney said that Pankos told them he saw the tapes. Remember? These are the tapes that weren't supposed to exist. And the article says that Hustler magazine publisher Larry Flint fueled the controversy when he said he had copies of the tapes. Now, in order to show the motive for her death, they have subpoenaed these tapes. Now, Larry Flint could produce these tapes or tell where they went to show the motive for incarcerating him in a federal mental hospital all this time and for drugging him, similar to what they did to Howard Hughes and a lot of other people. and taking his mind away and putting him into a federal pen and causing him almost to lose the empire that he had built up. Now, these tapes, Marvin Pankow says, exist. He says that high government officials shown on the videotapes were visiting Vicki Morgan in her North Hollywood condominium where she was killed the month before her death. High government officials were enjoying the pleasure of Vicki Morgan's body, and that the tapes do in fact exist, and the name of one official, presidential counsel and attorney general nominee Edwin Meese, surfaced during the pre-trial motions. They want other White House or government officials who were at the sex parties, and then it goes on that Bloomingdale from Ronald Reagan's kitchen cabinet has been investigated by the Los Angeles police for ties to prostitution. That's one story. And then another one this week in Time magazine, I understand Don Freed told me that Time is ready to roll with the Vicki Morgan, Edwin Meese tapes. Time, this magazine, has a story about Alfred Bloomingdale, how he wanted to be the ambassador to France, I guess at the same time that Mr. Annenberg was the ambassador to London. And oh my goodness, this high society I've been talking about for years, it goes on and on. Bloomingdale could not be ambassador to France because of his long association with Vicki Morgan, his 12-year affair. And then it said his name came up in connection with FBI files in the 1960s and with connections to organized crime. That'll be in Time this week. And he paid $5,000 in blackmail. That was pretty cheap in those days, 15 years ago, because of his habit of beating up prostitutes. For $5,000, he could shut them up. But then the article goes on to say that he was chosen by Ronald Reagan as an appointee for the Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board in 1981. Remember the high society and Nancy's borrowed diamonds from Winston and her satin dresses and white gloves and her very best friend Betsy and the prostitutes at the house and the whipping and the chains and the sex parties and the government officials. Well, you'll be hearing more of that in the time to come. Now, a few items on the sex, going away from the sex and to Dallas, Texas conspiracy that is always in the back of my mind because I claim that when John Kennedy was murdered in Texas, the power shifted from Washington to New York to Houston and to Texas because they held the blackmail on the federal government, the CIA, the FBI, Navy intelligence on the murder of John Kennedy. And therefore, the building up of the empire of the banking industry in Houston, the spies, the espionage, would revert back to Dallas where the scene of the crime was because the power is in the information. If we had tried these people for murdering or for covering up murder, which should be done, the power may have a better balance, but whoever knows the dirty tricks controls the power in this country. Now, there were 4 articles of major importance this week in the paper. One, again from the Houston Post, computer to aid U.S. in tracking foreigners. In Dallas, Texas, the computer will be built that will control all U.S. ports of entry and, of course, exit. They'll keep track of everybody entering the United States. It was made, this computer, to spot terrorists, smugglers, especially during the Olympic Games and the World's Fair in New Orleans. They will have access immediately to 22 million people. Well, how fast can you add more names to the computer? It'll start with 22 million names, and they decided that this new center for everybody entering and exiting the United States will allow officials to enter the name and origin of any suspicious person at any ports of entry, and within seconds, the Dallas Center will give the information needed. That means that every passport, that day or night, every city, passport, oh, you're going to Tokyo, okay, into the computer. Oh, passport to Philippines, okay. And they'll do more on that in the LAPD and the flights in a second. But the center for entering and exiting the United States, every airline, is now in Dallas, Texas. Now, a small item from the Houston Post, many of you, I don't know if you saw it, I didn't see it in my other papers here, and my friend in Houston sends me a big envelope of articles every week, once a week. Services are set Monday for John Will Fritz, Captain Fritz of the Dallas Police Department, the investigator who interrogated Lee Harvey Oswald after the assassination of John Kennedy. He was 87. Okay, let's not say he was murdered, a primary witness. I'll give you a natural death at 87, Captain Will Fritz. One of the most important people of American history who, like Joseph Mengele or Borman, lived out his time until a nice ripe old age. I described in several sentences, in essence, Will Fritz with Lee Harvey Oswald when I wrote a section for the People's Almanac, number 2. It was published by David Walensky and Irving Wallace, his father. And on page 41, I was doing a chronological order of everything that Oswald said. They asked me to do from the moment Kennedy was killed until Oswald was killed. And on page 48 of the Almanac, the People's Almanac, number 2, 4:45 to 6:30 p.m. on Friday, November 22nd, Lee Harvey Oswald is in the office of Captain Will Fritz, the gentleman who died this week. And Sheriff Craig is in there, the sheriff who saw Lee Harvey Oswald enter a white station wagon 15 minutes after the assassination. And in the conversation, Oswald confirms in front of Captain Fritz that he was the person that got into the station wagon. There was a man impersonating Oswald in Dallas. There were a lot of them. One that got into the taxi, the bus first, then the cab, and later then the rooming house. But Oswald could have been taken from the cab to the rooming house. But the point is, what he said to Will Fritz, who's now dead, was, that station wagon belongs to Mrs. Ruth Paine. Don't try to tie her into this. She had nothing to do with it. I told you people I did. I said, everybody will know who I am now. That is one of the most important sentences of the entire 26 volumes of the Warren Commission hearings, because of all the researchers, they have over 230 books on the Kennedy assassination, questioning the Warren Report, and I've never been able to get a single researcher in the United States to help me tell people, other than say my radio program or my writing, what it means. Everybody will know who I am now. Now, Ruth Paine was married and I think he passed away, Michael Paine, but was married at the time, to Michael Paine, a third-generation Harvard physicist who worked at Bell Helicopter under under General Dornberger, the Nazi war criminal who was supposed to be hung at Nuremberg. General Dornberger ran Bell Aerospace, and Paine worked for him, and Oswald and Marina stayed at their home. And Oswald said, I got into the white station wagon. And that was the interesting connection, because the doubles in the cab and in the bus were not Lee Harvey Oswald. The one at the rooming house with Earlene Roberts he took the white station wagon and went back to the rooming house and got a gun, but he didn't kill Officer Tippit. But, okay, this chief of police is Will Fritz, he's gone now to the great beyond, and Ruth Paine one of these days will expire, and that will be the end of that story. We're losing all the traces of this story. Now, along with Texas, with the power of Houston, Dallas, and Austin, Texas, University of Texas reveals a $32 million endowment. I was worried about the mysterious $8 million that wasn't named. They now exceed, the endowment faculty puts it way ahead of universities, including Harvard University. They're going to study biology, chemistry, computer engineering, microelectronics, all science, all engineering. A hunk of the money comes from the Sid Richardson Foundation, the Oil People of Dallas, with the connections to John Connolly, the Cullen Trust for Higher Education, the Welch Foundation. I don't know if that's the Welch of the John Birch Society. I thought he was from New England, and the University of Texas Engineering Foundation. They have come up just recently with $32 million endowment, but another article from the Houston Post said the endowment will help the University of Texas complete its commitment to Microelectronics and Computer Technology Corporation, an international computer brain trust located in Austin last year. They will share the University of Texas premises, shared facilities, and research. This is University of Texas, $32 million endowment just last month that poured in, and it will help them with the microelectronic international computer brain. Now also, just April 16th, this last month, Microelectronic Computer Technology, that's the one affiliated with this new $32 million, is run by Bobby Inman. We've talked about him before, and I was worried about that, in Austin, Texas, a staff of 110 scientists. It is a combine privately owned. A hunk of money was put in. Bobby Inman was deputy director of the CIA, director of the National Security Agency, head of Task Force 157 with Henry Kissinger and Edwin Wilson and Frank Turple and Robert Keith Gray. He moved to Austin, Texas, and set up as a private company like the Hughes Organization the major computer companies of the entire world, like Rockwell and Sperry, BMC, the Control Data, Honeywell, the digital equipment. They got a hunk of millions of dollars. So it's not only engineering and the technology that is available. I call it the electronic ODESSA. It's going to be in Austin. It'll work, and they will grab the best scientists, the best engineers, the best people who can pass those tests, like the security people for the Olympic Games. They will have a team from the CIA privately endowed for anything they want to do with it. We'll take a 1-minute break and go on to a little more hairy and scary news. Country, and Dallas. Now we'll continue on side 2 of broadcast number 649, May the 14th, 1984. There is a lawsuit going on in Washington, D.C. to turn over information on the CARTERGATE papers. The election is coming up, and a lawsuit has been filed before Judge Harold Green, to get a special prosecutor to go into how papers were stolen that made it possible for Ronald Reagan to be briefed on subjects he didn't know from the National Security Council, from the CIA. How did he get the information? He literally had it stolen for him, and it went to Edwin Meese and William Casey and Robert Gray and a whole group of other people. Now, this lawsuit has been filed, and the Justice Department, William French Smith, says you can't have a special prosecutor unless I appoint him, and I won't appoint him. And the lawsuit is put on by Professor John Banzhaf, Banzhaf III, who says to Judge Green, you can't let the Attorney General decide whether or not to prosecute this case or investigate this case, that the ethics law was set up after Watergate, a 1978 ethics law that was set up that if the Justice Department, because of conflicts of interest, because the Attorney General is always the best friend of the President, if the ethics law can't be obeyed by the Attorney General, then a special prosecutor has to be brought in. And the Attorney General, William French Smith, says, I don't want a prosecutor. I looked into it and there's no reason. And yet the documents exist to prove that he's lying. And this is a very simple but a very complicated question of getting this into a court of law. There's a story in the Washington Post. There's several good articles. One in the Oregonian that a very fine friend sends me, and I never get a chance to write and thank these people. I get these large envelopes of articles. The U.S. fights the suit to name Carter's paper proper. That's the way it's written, a little complicated. The Justice Department asked the judge to dismiss this lawsuit, asking for a special prosecutor. On February the 29th, Justice Green rejected the Justice Department motion to dismiss the suit. They said that it appears that they have simply ignored the Ethics in Government Act, William French Smith has, and that the Justice Department says the decision to have the prosecutor belongs not under the Ethics Act, but the Attorney General. You get this. I hope it isn't too complicated. Let me just explain once again. There is massive evidence that every agency, practically the government, was briefing and helping Ronald Reagan know the answers, not only for the one-night debate, but through the whole election campaign. Pilfered papers were grooming this actor from Hollywood, this buffoon, this high society, to answer the right questions. And the names of the people involved are available. And it took 8 months of investigation that the Justice Department was obligated to say, okay, it's obvious, I, William French Smith, the attorney of the president, his personal attorney, now you're Attorney General, I can't handle it, we have to have a prosecutor. He said there's no need for it. And the law professor from Washington University Law says, yes, there is a need. so that this investigation is going round and round. They've asked Jacob Stein, the special prosecutor appointed to investigate Edwin Meese, to go into the area of Meese's role in the stolen papers. Now, if the Attorney General says there wasn't anything, is it right for Stein to say there is no evidence, or does the special prosecutor come on? And the Justice Department says, if we don't do it, you can't have it. The Washington Post has a story, the post-Watergate law sets up a procedure leading to the appointment of an independent counsel or special prosecutor. But without invoking the provisions of the Act, the Justice Department just said, no, you don't need it, and I'm not going into it. The New York Times has a very good story, April 28th, on the problem going round and around about the ethics law that demands, in the case of blatant irregularities, blatant breaking of the law, that the Attorney General appointed, if he doesn't want to, the Justice Department says, then you can't have it. And we're warming up. This is June and the election's in November. The guy stole the last election, and his Attorney General, who wants to run home, isn't going to do anything about it. Now, there was a story in the Washington Times, jumping from that to Henry Kissinger, and in the article it says that Henry Kissinger said, as a result of misinformed public opinion, Henry Kissinger will not accept any future assignments because of harassment and threats he faces during public appearances. Henry Kissinger is not appearing in public. I wish I could have gotten up to San Jose. I wrote those brochures or the sheets on Henry Kissinger and Fritz Kramer. Tell us about your mentor. Was he Hitler's number 33 prisoner at Dachau? I wish I could have been at one of the last public appearances that Henry Kissinger was going to. He canceled his speech in Florida. He's a paper tiger, and when you hit the truth, I bet the Kramer-Kissinger thing hurts him worse than anything. He canceled a speech he was to give down in Florida. He appeared in Houston, and there were demonstrations. He appeared in San Francisco, and they had to call out the police. There were so many demonstrators, about 200 people, and mass arrests. You notice how that's been hushed up. I'm waiting to see who was arrested so I can contact them with the Fritz Kramer information. That's hushed up. Then he canceled Tufts University with former heads of states. Now here is an article, April 18th, 1984. He's not making any more public appearances. Good riddance, Herr Kissinger. Let's keep after you until you're not seen anywhere, until you're just laid out or hung up by Mussolini. Now, a few quick items, and then I'm going on to J. Paul in the Los Angeles Police Department, which I think is one of the most important stories, ongoing stories, and has been for the last year and a half. One-inch story in the San Francisco Chronicle this week. If you don't have a microscope or magnifying glass, you may be missing this. Meese's aide quits. One sentence. James G. Jenkins, deputy to the White House counselor Edwin Meese, will leave his post on Tuesday to become executive vice president of Trans World Group Limited, an export-import company, and chairman of the Trans World Engineering and Construction Service, period. Export-import is the CIA and Defense Department. It doesn't say what city. He's leaving. The rat is leaving the sinking ship. James Jenkins' name comes into a lot of papers about the selling of the Meese house, the arrangements and the financial arrangements of Edwin Meese, and the scandals that the special prosecutor is investigating. When the Los Angeles Police Department story broke in the lawsuit by the Civil Liberties Union against their illegal spying, a whole hunk of team of the Public Disorder Information Division retired, and you always see the retired captain of the police testify this, and retired Captain Loomis did this, and retired captain, he went somewhere else. They got off the ship and had to leave to be former people so that when the court of law was started to function, they wouldn't be called, and then the police had to settle out of court for almost $2 million instead of letting it go to court. I talked about the murder, I think the murder of certain actors and producers last week, and I'm just going to mention one death, two deaths this week to update you. One is Bob Moretti, who was buried today, the ex-Assembly Speaker in California, a close friend of Willie Brown. He suffered a fatal heart attack. He was all of 47 years old, playing tennis, but he had an earlier heart attack earlier in the year, and at 47 he was out. For several years when Ronald Reagan was president, he fought him tooth and nail governor, not president, from 1971 to 74. He was right there fighting him on Medicare problems, welfare reforms, on education for the people who couldn't afford it. He was a fighter, and he was knocked out, a heart condition, and he kept Ronald Reagan at least some position, sparring with him so Reagan couldn't become the total parafascist state that I've described in the book, California, the first parafascist state. Well, Bob Moretti died this week. If the Democrats surface again, you'll have one less person who defended your rights with your Medicare and your various privileges or your education or for your children and grandchildren. And another controversial person who died this week, another one-sentence article from the LA Times, get out again, the old magnifying glass or the microscope, bystander who subdued Hinckley dies. Now dig this, this is from Reuters News Service, not the Associated Press, not the United Press in America, Cleveland, from Cleveland, Ohio, Alfred Antonucci, that very controversial person, 71 years old, who subdued and held John Hinckley Jr. after he attempted the assassination of Reagan. He held his hand down. He died of a heart ailment in Cleveland, Ohio, and he was very controversial. The government harassed him. They bugged him. They got him out of a labor union. I'll do more on the role that he had. He just happened to put Hinckley's hand down, and I guess the powers that be didn't like it. So they punished him instead of helping him. And so this fellow died, and it seems to me that's an American news story. It would make a little more than just the Reuters, but maybe you'll find in your other papers too. All I saw is May the 11th, 1984, bystander who subdued Hinckley. If he didn't subdue Hinckley, we'd have Alexander Haig, George Bush. So you can see that the powers that be, we'd have our CIA director Bush, who worked with over Bobby Inman and the whole Task Force 157 and the real terror network of the United States. Nobody appreciated the fact that he stopped Hinckley, so therefore he had to suffer. Quick story from Minneapolis. Flunking kindergartners. 11% of the children in Minnesota fail to go to first grade. Kindergartners are flunked. 11% can't meet Minnesota standards. They have to go to summer school. We'll do more on that later, but just a comment about America. And Mark Rich, the fellow who bought a 50% of Pebble Beach in 20th Century Fox with Marvin Davis. New York Times has a story this week. A lawyer for the Swiss government appeared before the United States Court of Appeals to urge the end of the $50,000 fine Mark Rich is paying. He took out of this country at least, there's a variance of $48 million to $100 million in taxes. And instead of coming to the United States and coughing up what happened and paying $48 million to the United States taxes, because we could use that money for rapid transit, clean air, environmental protection, he's paid $15.3 million in fines since June 29 of 1983. It is total insanity. Almost every article I'm reading is total insanity. It's hard to describe whether it's entering kindergarten or being willing to pay $15 million since June on a $48 million tax fine. Why not come home and just pay it? It's crazy. Now to the Los Angeles Police Department. I was going to do an entire hour on it, but because the Olympics and the Soviet Union charges, but I'm just going to briefly mention 3 articles because I have a filing cabinet in chronological order of major stories of the Los Angeles Police Department to share with you, because the LAPD is piped into computers outside of the city that go to homes and offices in Alexandria, Virginia, to John Reese. And I do want to do a lot more on John Reese for you and share that information of who it goes to. I want to update this for you. It's like Mae Brussell reading mystery stories or movies or books. I like to know the punchline, so I'm going to tell you the punchline before I get to the part about J. Paul. The punchline was that after a trial was going on all this year that cost the city of Los Angeles almost $2 million, that the settlement out of court, the leaking of J. Paul's computer to the Western Goals to Larry MacDonald, the trial of the police commission was over. 3 members of the police board had a hearing for the last 3 months to decide if J. Paul did anything illegal. He was charged for 9 counts of misconduct, never mentioned his wife or the board of Western Goals, as I said before, But this is the way the Los Angeles Herald has the headlines in like 1 inch of black ink. J. Paul suspended as superiors blamed. You would translate that to mean that he was taken off the police force and that the people over him were blamed for his being removed. But then you get to the fine print. He was suspended for 10 days, but can be hired almost immediately. This is verbatim. He's to be given his $12,000 money of salary that he wasn't earning for the hearing since January. And 8 of the 9 counts of improper behavior were dropped against him. It didn't matter that John Reese, that sleazy animal from Western Goals that even J. Edgar Hoover said you shouldn't trust in his reports. What was going on I've described on the air week after week. But this hearing was over. He was suspended for 10 days. As I say, could be restated immediately, paid his $12,000, 8 of the 9 charges gone. L.A. Police Chief Daryl Gates had the nerve in the interview to say, in quotes, "Justice has been done." The police investigated themselves. 3 policemen, not a court of law. They had papers that were ordered destroyed in 1975 that have gone. Now they can go to Bobby Inman's computer and down to Dallas and down to the home of the international computers at Austin and in Dallas. And that's why it was so important. If you leave this country or enter it, they have all this information going back to the 60s and 70s, and it is sealed and just transferred out. He was exonerated by the Los Angeles Police Department, the Board of Rights, the 3-member hearing. It didn't matter that they shared the database with Western Goals. He was only found guilty of providing John Reese with Los Angeles police intelligence data for 1 day in March. 1 day in March. He compiled dossiers on the police commission, on politicians, on judges, on activists. Another story, besides the one being blamed, that was the Herald, was the Los Angeles Times. And this headline, of course, reads, "Paul guilty of 1 count in police spying case." And then this goes into the very simple charges that he got for this particular article. I'll outline each of those articles. 1 lousy count he was charged with for these proceedings. And 5 or 6 of his superiors knew of the computerized data. That comes in the other article, and it came out through the other articles. Captain Robert Loomis, who retired, moved to Nevada, and he was in charge of the bomb squad, the nuclear bases, the nuclear bombs. He lives in Nevada. Captain John Cleghorn, I've mentioned him before, went on from J. Paul's terrorist division along with them to be in charge of the anti-terrorist division, where the Olympic Games and terrorism will be secure from J. Paul's team. Cleghorn is the commander. Lieutenant Thomas Scheidecker, who took the papers home, who I've talked about, linked to Navy intelligence, and the CIA is back to the police department working with the networks up and down to the Office of Emergency Service and throughout the state of California and into Navy intelligence around the world. Lieutenant Elmer Schiller, Schiller, is in the anti-terrorist division in charge of Olympic security. These are the people that worked with the computerized data bag that went from the Los Angeles Police Department and the files going back to the 60s and 70s to J. Paul, that goes to Virginia, and then to Bobby Inman, because Edward Teller and Mr. Stinlab and the Steinholtz and the whole gang worked directly with Henry Kissinger and Bobby Inman, and then they go down to Houston and Austin and the University of Texas and Dallas. I'll make this full circle until you really see it. And that is and then Detective Charles Russell knew, and then Lieutenant Gus Drulius, Drulis, of the Terror Division. 3 men of the Terrorist Division in charge of the Olympic security. And here's Daryl Gates, I mentioned on the first half of this broadcast, who's saying, "Hey, you Russians can come to Los Angeles and help us make this place secure." I called the Soviet Union TASS agency in Washington, D.C., and asked the head of TASS in Washington if the decision to come to the Olympic Games had anything to do with J. Paul, Western Goals, Larry MacDonald, and then linking to the Korean Airline Committee in Los Angeles. And I wrote the name of the gentleman. I'll put it on the air next week. I forgot to bring it in. Do you know what he told me? He didn't know what Western Goals was. TASS, the Soviet Union newspaper, felt there would be terrorism in Los Angeles and never heard of Western Goals. And I thought, how could this be? But do you know this story, and I've reminded you over and over again, never made the wire services except once. The front page of the Washington Post, I believe it was August the 18th, mentioned Representative Larry MacDonald of the John Birch Society and Western Goals, and the links of his computer that he bought that tapped with John Reese and J. Paul to the illegal compilation of police files. And within 2 weeks, Larry MacDonald was dead. The board of Western Goals was never mentioned. And Tess, I said, I will, next week, I was busy this week, take the sheets from the broadcast I've had and the tapes and send them to you. You've never heard of Larry MacDonald and the LAPD, and you feel insecure about Los Angeles. When I send you these, maybe you'll feel a little more secure. I don't think he was lying to me. He said he didn't know about it. Now, there was a biography of J. Paul in the newspaper. When a story is over, when he's released, when he gets his money, when he's back on the police force, probably by tonight, then they do a biography. And Joel Sappel from the Los Angeles Times, who I've telephoned many times when the trials were going on, had a page-and-a-half story, April the 30th, 1984, on J. Paul. And we only have 7 minutes. I wanted to give you the whole story because most of you don't get the Los Angeles Times. And again, no Associated Press, no Wire Press, not picked up. He described J. Paul as alone in the center of a sensational scandal. Well, Nixon was the center of Watergate. Hitler was the center of World War II. Western Goals was ignored, and J. Paul was the center. We have a way of centering a person, and he can't do it alone, she can't do it alone, and making them the only person. And then on top of that, he's not only the center, but he's given all his money and the total approval of the Los Angeles Police Department. Now, they described his background, the family that moved from Brooklyn. I'll do more later. He went to a military academy in Los Angeles where he was the only Jew. Familiar? Bernard Weissman, the only Jew with the Nazis that came from Munich, Germany, that worked with Robert Morris and H.L. Hunt. Jack Ruby, the Jew that killed Lee Harvey Oswald, silenced him. He said, the world will know who I am. On Friday and on Sunday, there's a corpse, okay? Jack Ruby worked with H.L. Hunt, the anti-Semites, the John Birch Society, the group that Larry MacDonald's to take over, Connie Trammell, Larry Schmidt, Bernard Weissman, and the whole gang. He didn't know Weissman. Jack Ruby didn't know Weissman. They were the only Jews, and Ruby was looking to see why Weissman's name was on the billboard, wanted for treason. And they used those Jews, Rubenstein and Weissman, to link the murder of John Kennedy to the Jews, and then you'd think, well, all Jews are communists, and you'd go to that point. Roy Cohn, the Jew on Western Goals, with the pilot of the Luftwaffe, with the Mr. Wigner of the Galen Organization, with Admiral Moore, the Chief of Staff for Singlab, with the Nazis. Jew Cohn, okay? J. Paul, the Jew, the police department. They take a Jew and put him among the Nazis, the anti-Semites, the Birch Society, and they take these mentally deformed people who live vicariously. It's a sort of fratricide of killing their own people and live vicariously of being with the in-group. And when in comes down, we line up these Jews like Bernard Weissman, Jack Ruby, and J. Paul, and Roy Cohn. What a disgrace. But I'm sure there's a lot of people that are nice. There are Jews that may say, no, thank you, I don't want the job. But the role of American history is woven with people that are cop-outs and sellouts. I'm not just anti-Vatican Mafia connections or anti-Mormon data bank connections. I cover the spectrum of where the chips fall, and these guys are a disgrace. And two little stories about J. Paul that I want to get into this broadcast. J. Paul worked for the police department. He was going to Japan, and he had some reason to think he would be killed in Japan. They don't go why. So what he does, it's a commercial airline, and they set a personal trip. It's not a military plane. He calls the airline and gets the passenger list of everybody on his flight. And he goes through each name and puts it into his computers and the Los Angeles Police Intelligence and finds that 2 members of the Communist Party are on the plane. And then he says he thought he would be killed, because 2 communists were on it. Now, this was quite a few years back, and J. Paul isn't a household word, and his work with anti-communists or Birch Society wasn't in the open. But listen to this. Commercial airlines give passenger lists to people from the police department. Remember, I told you I stopped lecturing at colleges because things happened to me on 6 consecutive airplanes, luggage, hotel rooms, doors that didn't close on planes, and so forth. And you think you're paranoid. They give lists of people on airlines. E. Howard Hunt on the airline coming up here once from L.A., that I recognized. He was on the plane coming up here. Coincidental? Maybe. They know, oh, so-and-so's on this plane. He's arriving in this town. A cab can follow them. Where do they go? 2 members of the Communist Party on his plane. The point is that he thought he would be killed because 2 communists were on his plane. Now think of him working with Larry MacDonald, who became a martyr at the hands of the communists like J. Paul thought he was going to be. The head of Western Goals and the military, where MacDonald is the buffoon front for the real high Joint Chief of Staff. The computers that work with the police intelligence, the police Gestapo in L.A. Larry MacDonald is sent to South Korea and is martyred for the anti-Soviet demonstrations, and they're referred to as beasts. All the evidence has come out that the United States knew what they were doing, and there's a lawsuit now. I just saw an article about the prosecution against the United States government because they had the communications and could have warned, and the defense of the government for the people whose family were killed on the Korean Airlines, it was in the paper last week, is that the government does not have to tell you if the plane is in danger. So they knew Congressman Larry MacDonald was going down, just like Leslie Howard went down, and they didn't want to break the code of British intelligence. The Japanese intelligence, the Korean intelligence, the American martyred him. Now, he was martyred by the communists exactly like J. Paul thought he was going to be. And it's very revealing, his explanations and his methods and what they do, because remember, Larry MacDonald didn't go out with his secretary, with his members of Congress, with his staff, his liaison. Goodness knows, as I wrote in the article I wrote for Larry Flynn and the Hustler, he went alone. This guy must have had B.O. or must have been suspicious of something, that nobody with his whole party in South Korea wanted to travel with Larry MacDonald. But here is the mentality of J. Paul, and it worked with MacDonald. And one other item in here, because we just have 2 minutes, and I'll do more about this. He tells about an ordinary day. This article tells an ordinary day in the life of J. Paul. This is what it is, a typical day. This is from the Los Angeles Times, April the 30th. A typical day on any given day, Paul says he would drop by the federal building for a chat with the Central Intelligence Agency. He would then grab lunch with a lawyer from the B'nai B'rith Anti-Defamation League. Then he would stop by the Rand Corporation. The Rand Corporation is being quoted every day, and Mr. Jenkins on the terrorism of the Olympics and the terrorism to come. And then he'd have dinner with a friend from the John Birch Society. Think of the power of H.L. Hunt and the John Birch Society, what they did in Dallas, how Robert Morris and the Americans for Freedom and Ronald Reagan, all part of the John Birch Society. That was a typical day. Oh, hi, here comes Paul back from New Orleans.
Yes, yes.
How was the jazz? Good?
It was excellent.
Okay, well, Paul is here, and my time is up. I will do a lot more on that story of J. Paul, the CIA, the Rand Corporation, the Anti-Terrorist Division. It's a biography when the case allegedly was over. But after he wrote that story, then there's the lawsuit of the Civil Liberties Union against Western Goals. So we go into Act 3 of that story, and it's juicing up. The story isn't over yet, and it will evolve and evolve. And in the meanwhile, the top officials from the Reagan administration who were sexing with Vicki Morgan a month before she was killed will probably surface. So there'll be a lot of interesting things in the news in the weeks and years to come. And in the meantime, this is Mae Brussell. It's KAZU FM in Pacific Grove, California. Was it fun?
Oh, I had a great time.
You did?
I really did, yeah.
Did you suntan? Was it warm?
Oh, gosh, it was hot
The
down
bayou?
Forced out.